Hello everyone, welcome back to Let's Play Great Ace Attorney 2 Ryunosuke's Resolve. This is V-Diffuser. In our last episode we summoned these two guys to the stands and found out, as we expected, the botched evidence for the prosecution and the jailbreak are intrinsically connected. We'll see how deep this rabbit hole goes. As the warder responsible for the condemned convicts, I attended to Mr. Sogi and kept watch over his cell. Now then... in Mr. Asogi's kimono. Aye! The one he brought with him when he was locked up. Yes, he was permitted to have his personal effects with him during his incarceration, I understand. That's right. He was granted as much freedom as possible during the few days before his execution. Indeed, he had a number of items of personal significance, I remember. He was very reluctant to part with them. Some books, that kimono, his sword. His sword? Why would you let someone in prison have his sword? Karama, the famous sword of the Asogi clan. It bears the soul of my family. I don't doubt it, but I wasn't really getting at that. Forget it being the soul of the clan. Could the man have a more obvious weapon? Have some respect, Ryunosuke. Respectful silence. The warders carry firearms at all times, and the inmates have shackles around their ankles. He couldn't have hurt anybody with that thing. Still, he was allowed a sword, but no writing materials? Aye. He wrote that will before he came to stay with us in Park Legacy. Dr. Mikotobo was asked to bring the necessary Japanese writing implements to the prosecutor's office. A Suzuri inkstone, black sumi ink, and some Hanchi rice paper, no doubt. I was present when he wrote it, but I'm sorry to say, the letters just look like a squirming mack of jet black earthworms to me.
Excuse me.
Are you feeling faint, Mr. Vigil? Ugh. Mr. Vigil. Sir! It was Scarlet, sir. What? Oh, I'm terribly sorry. I didn't mean to blurt it out like that. Less swaying, more explaining would be helpful. Is it something about the testimony we heard? Have you recalled something of importance? Something of importance? Possibly, or possibly not. I'm unable to tell which way he's leaning, I'm afraid. My lord, the defense asks that Mr. Vigil be permitted to supplement his testimony with this possibly or possibly not important detail. Permission granted. Go on ahead, Mr. Vigil. Yes, it was Scarlet. As I remember it, the document was written in scarlet ink, but perhaps I'm mistaken. Am I doing this right? I'll press first. Scarlet, you say? Well, yes. I mean, I only caught sight of it for a brief moment, of course. But by the dim light I read in the cell, I remember thinking it was an unusual color. At the very least, I'm quite sure it wasn't black. Witness, is that really what you saw? Alright, what? Sir! Is something wrong, Lord Strongheart? I apologize. Continue. What do you make of that, Lord and Mr. Naruhodo? For Lord Strongheart to be so visibly shaken in that way. Ugh, didn't I have her? You can plainly see right in here. It's as black as the Earl of Hell's waistcoat. Well, yes, you're right. Mr. Vigil, I'd like to confirm one point with you. Did you actually see the content of the document Mr. Asogi was hiding that night? Oh, well, no. I mean, there was no time. As soon as he noticed me there, he hid it behind his back. But it was definitely a will, wasn't it? Yes, it was. That was what Mr. Asogi told me. The court need waste no further time on this matter. We have the will in question in our possession. There is nothing more to add. A will written in scarlet ink? What did Mr. Vigil really see Kazuma's father holding, I wonder? If you have an inkling, Mr. Naruhodo, you must present it to the court at once. Doesn't give much away. So this will really was penned by Kazuma-sama's father. I wonder what he could possibly have meant when he described it as a weapon. Actually had nothing. But the plan to break him out of jail went ahead, which means he must have had some bargaining power. It's the only explanation that makes sense. Actually might have had something. Which is it, Mr. Naruhodo? I'm not sure, but I feel as though I'm on the brink of understanding all this. Alright, we'll see if this actually works. 3, 4, 5, 6. Alright, time to present it. Okay, that was actually it. Scarlet-colored writing is what you said you thought you saw, Mr. Vigil. And I believe that's exactly what you did see. What? Havers again! You've no evidence to say that! Have a look at this report. That's my brother's autopsy report. Yes, and there's something in here that's bothered me since I first read it. It states that scarlet-colored ink stains were noted on the fingers of the victim's right hand. Yes, so it does. Scarlet ink? Now, I'm not familiar with the habits of the British aristocracy, I freely admit. But I'd have to guess that they don't all go around with ink stains on their fingers, do they? Your wit is not appreciated. My brother was a well-bred and fastidious man. You're on a roll with that one. Oh, that one was horrible. Should ink have sullied his fingertips, he would have cleaned them immediately. What is your point, counsel? My point is this. Whatever Lord Clint Van Zieks was writing in that unusually colored ink must have been directly before his death, because he died before he had the opportunity to clean his hands. What? I remember something troubled me at the time. At the scene, the lid of my brother's inkwell was open. But Clint was punctilious about such things, it seemed. Unusual. And no document penned in the color of the ink that was in the inkwell was ever found. So the document had disappeared. Are you suggesting that the document my father had in his hand that night in his cell was the same document Lord Clint Van Zieks was writing moments before his death? Then, it was... If Mr. Vigil's testimony is to be believed, it can only mean that, yes, he had a last will and testament. It wasn't his, though. Mr. Vigil. Sir! When you spotted Mr. Asogi with the document in his cell, his precise words were as follows, were they not? Alright then, but what's on that paper? A last will and testament. This will is the only weapon I have left now. A last will and testament. Ah! If the conversation really did go as Mr. Vigil says, then what we now know completely changes the meaning of what Mr. Asogi said. You really think? Mr. Vigil did indeed see the convict with a will, but it wasn't that of Genshin Asogi. It was the last will and testament of Lord Clint Van Zeeks. No. What?
Objection!
This is madness. My brother's last will and testament? That would mean he'd chosen to die. That is what it would mean, yes. No! Impossible! This is utterly out of the question! Lord Van Zeeks... Clint was pursuing the professor. It consumed him day and night. Whatever happened, he would never have abandoned his investigation before its conclusion. Never! He wouldn't rest until the job was done. Until the killer was caught. The idea he would willingly accept his own death. It's obscene! Yeah, well, what if he was the professor?
Objection!
And yet, we can be sure he was writing his will moments before his death. And that Genshin Asogi came to be in possession of that document. So what could the will possibly have contained? Clearly something that couldn't be made public under any circumstances whatsoever. Because armed with that document, my father was able to negotiate with the judiciary for his life. It was something so damning, it prompted the powers that be to enact that daring jailbreak plot. Yes, there could be no question that the will contained information of the utmost secrecy. Information of the utmost secrecy. Ah! No, it couldn't be. You got to it right now. I've heard more than enough. Pursuing this notion of a phantom will nobody can attest to having seen serves absolutely no purpose.
Objection!
No, my lord. That's unacceptable. What did you say, counsel? The last will and testament that Genshin Asogi had in his possession was that of Lord Clint Van Zeeks. All the testimony and evidence presented to the court has logically led us to that as a possibility. We have a duty to pursue the line of reasoning to its conclusion. But with no possible means of knowing the contents of that document, there's no line of reasoning to pursue. You know something, don't you? A reason why Lord Clint Van Zeeks, a man of high noble standing, would have chosen death. Information so secret, people in the judiciary would be willing to negotiate the jailbreak of a condemned killer. There is only one explanation that fits those facts. It's an unthinkable truth that turns absolutely everything on its head. But it's just too hideous. Mr. Naruhodo, however difficult the situation might become, you work with your client in pursuit of the truth. That's what you resolved to do when you entered the courtroom this morning, if I'm not mistaken. Miss Susato. So hold your head high and keep soldiering on. Yes, you're right. 10 years ago, in his final moments, Lord Clint Van Zeeks left behind a will. A will that Genshin Asogi was able to use as a weapon to negotiate his escape from prison. In all probability, the details in the will were related to the professor case. The defense's last statement is mere conjecture. What are you getting at, man? Ryunosuke. As soon as these words come out of my mouth, there's no going back. I believe the last will and testament of Lord Clint Van Zeeks was, in fact, a confession. You can do this, Mr. Naruhodo. I believe that what Lord Clint Van Zieks actually penned that day was a confession. A confession? Regarding the mass murderer known as the Professor, and his true identity.
Objection!
Enough, Counsel. What are you saying? Do you even realize? A confession about the true identity of the Professor. That would mean... Lord Van Zieks, I appreciate this must be hard to take in. But it's the only explanation that fits. The killer that terrorized London a decade ago and became known as the Professor, the man believed to have murdered 5 members of the aristocracy, wasn't Genshin Asogi at all. No! You can't be suggesting! It was in fact the man believed to have been the 5th victim. Lord Clint Van Zieks himself. Look at those guys in the back. They're like, holy crap. It's finally open, isn't it? Pandora's box. The great Van Zieks family. They've been thoroughbreds of the British judiciary for years. And Lord Clint Van Zieks, he was a paragon of justice in the capital. But he was actually a mass murderer, a perpetrator of atrocities of the vilest nature. If the general public ever find out, law and order in this country would be uprooted. My brother. Oh, this is too awful. Poor Lord Van Zieks. I wonder, though, did he never suspect, Mr. Naruhodo? Lord Barrick Van Zieks is a brilliant prosecutor. Is it conceivable that he didn't realize when his older brother really was? Order! Order! Order in court! Lord Van Zieks. The Professor made use of an enormous hound as his murder weapon. Tell me, did your brother own a dog? Yes, he did. Balmung. He was a well-known hunting dog. People called him a giant. Well, nice mythological name for a hunting dog. Balmung, I believe, was the sword of Siegfried in the Nibelunglied. I don't believe this. When my brother would go hunting in the forest of the grounds behind the house, he always took Balmung. After Clint's death, the creature passed away too, almost as if he were following his master. He was a magnificent hunting dog, worthy of the jewel-studded collar around his neck. A big jewel-studded collar? That's right. Well, sadly, some years ago now, it was stolen by a thief who broke into the house one night. Well, 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 we've seen a jewel-studded collar, haven't we? It so happens that myself and my colleagues have come across such a collar during our time in London. How could you? There was an old emblem attached to the collar too, made of pure gold. There it is, topped with a small crown and borne an ornate capital letter B. What? An emblem bearing the initial B? Oh my, you know it? It's the insignia of the Baskerville family. Hunt, the Hound of the Baskervilles. What? The Baskerville? Why is that name coming out now? Baskerville is the family name of my late brother's widow. That pure gold emblem was an heirloom, which Clint acquired upon their marriage. There can be no doubt, then. The collar you've described was Balmung's. Someone stole Balmung's collar. The Lord insignia of Lord Clint Van Zieks' widow. There was considerable amount of blood on the collar when we saw it. Since we know that the dog was used for hunting, it could have been from its quarry, of course. But it could equally have been from human prey. So it is true then. Clint Van Zieks really was the professor. Impossible! These Japanese are making it all to exonerate their own. So in fact, the person responsible for these murders of nobles and royals was a noble himself. And that threatened to be an enormous scandal that would irrevocably destabilize British society. My father knew that, and was using it to negotiate his way out of the unjust charges brought out against him. But at the very last hour, those he bargained with betrayed him, slaying him mercilessly on foreign soil. Well, can you deny it, Lord Strongheart? 10 years have passed. And still now, the 6 million inhabitants of our great capital rest easy believing that justice was done. That though his anonymity remains, the diabolical murderer was caught and executed. Very well then. You may have the truth. Tell me then. Tell me what Clint really was. Lord Clint Van Zieks was too pure of heart. When he became a prosecutor and went in pursuit of the black roots of crime, he drove himself in a corner. He came to the uncomfortable realization that to fight the most fiendish of criminals requires one to become even more fiendish oneself. Yes. Clint. The 19th century was truly a miraculous 100 years for Great Britain, and indeed the whole world. New industry, new technology, and with the birth of the Metropolitan Police Service, new law and order. But these dazzling new developments meant even deeper shadows were cast on society. Water sullied by the factories, air thick with noxious fumes and crime, growing daily to fill the darkness. Lord Clint Van Zieks made it his mission to combat that darkness. But as time went on, it slowly ate at his soul, until eventually, he was consumed. It's ironic, really, and somewhat surprising, that the truth has once again been unearthed. After all, he who looks into the abyss should be aware that the abyss doesn't look back into it. He who fights monsters should be aware he shouldn't become one himself. By a Japanese. Once again, what do you mean? 10 years ago, your father, Ryunosuke, turned up at my office one night. The professor? Yes, beyond all shadow of a doubt. You must issue a warrant to search his home at once. Don't be absurd. The man comes from one of our country's most illustrious families. He's a paragon of justice here in the capital. Yes, that's the point. That's why none of you British can see it. He's using his noble status as a diversion, whilst he commits these atrocious crimes behind the scenes. Do you have any evidence? Nothing definitive as yet. But he keeps an enormous savage hound on the estate. We need the full support of the judiciary for this. We're up against a member of the aristocracy. So a large family estate is a fierce guard dog. You should know that's commonplace here in Britain. I'm sorry, but I can't possibly put Scotland Yard onto this based on the tenuous accusation of a visiting student. So I turned down Asogi's plea. And as a result, he took it upon himself to visit the Van Zieks mansion on his own. We can only imagine now what happened between the two men. But we know the outcome, of course. Lord Clint Van Zieks perished. I don't believe this. So in actual fact, Kazuma-sama's father's did. He made the late Lord Van Zieks meet the same fate. He put a permanent end to the professor killings by taking the drastic measure of ending the perpetrator's life. As soon as I hurried to the mansion. When I arrived, it was easy to grasp what had happened. And what about the will? Asogi must have already taken it. Nothing of that nature was found at the scene. We had no idea of the existence of such a document at the time. I was the only person who knew of the true identity of the professor. So, I resolved to keep it a secret, and to guard the secret to the bitter end. So you're admitting to it? That you were behind it all? It was you, then, who pinned the crimes on my father. I did what needed to be done in order to protect the law and order of the British Empire. Even if that meant employing an unforgivable ruse. Then it was you who arranged this fabricated evidence. I ordered that detective to take care of it, whilst keeping the truth from him, naturally. Gregson. Obviously. He opposed me at first. Are you off your rocker? We can't do something like that. There's no question that it was Asogi who murdered Lord Van Zieks. The house staff have made statements that they saw the man running from the mansion that night. Well, yes, I've no doubt it was that Japanese fella. But we haven't got a shred of conclusive evidence against the man. And worse than that, he doesn't keep a dog, so we're short of a murder weapon to boot. And we're short on time, Gregson. You must put a stop to this man's rampage, for the good of the country. So we'll use whatever means necessary. Do I make myself clear, detective? Blimey. So that night 10 years ago, when I was attacked by those thugs in the back streets, and Genshin's ring was taken, that was him, was it? That was Gregson and some hired help? Then the detective handed the stolen ring to Dr. Wilson, who feigned its discovery from the victim's stomach during that autopsy. And in the light of that decisive evidence, Mr. Asogi was found guilty of the charges brought against him. However, behind the scenes, he had actually already struck a deal with his accusers, in which he agreed to silently accept the charges. But I just don't believe that part. As far as I knew the man, my father despised such underhanded dealings. It was extremely easy to make him comply. You see, he had one crippling weakness. What weakness? Isn't it obvious? You, Kazuma Asogi. Me? Perhaps you have no desire to return to your homeland, Asogi. What? Though I hear you have a 14-year-old son. Agree to cooperate and accept your guilt without contention. And you will see Japan and your son again. You scoundrel! Whether you choose wisely or not, it will be a closed trial by order of Her Majesty. So whatever rash claims you make in the court, we'll have no trouble in stifling them. There's only one outcome for you, Asogi. The gallows. Don't forget that I still have a weapon at my disposal. A document revealing a truth that I know you're desperate to keep hidden. Yes, it had escaped my mind, which is the only reason I'm willing to bargain with you. I only want to protect this country's law and order. You understand. So, what's it to be, Asogi? We'll find out next time.
Have no doubt, I'm in control. You may think chasing ghosts is